A stolen moment of peace. The summer sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. Marcus Hayes, a 30-year-old black man with a muscular build that reflected his discipline and hard work, stood at the edge of the community pool, looking out over the sparkling water. After a grueling 12-hour shift between two jobs, the long stretch of the day had left his body aching and his mind clouded with stress. This was his sanctuary, the one place where he could temporarily shed the weight of the world and just breathe. The sun beat down relentlessly, but the pool, nestled in the center of the residential area, offered a welcome reprieve. The water was cool and inviting, almost like an old friend that Marcus could count on to ease the tension from his muscles and calm the fury in his mind. He had lived in this neighborhood for over a year now, and every evening after work, he made his way to the pool to enjoy a few hours of solitude. Slipping into the water with a sigh, he submerged himself fully, feeling the rush of coolness against his skin. He kicked his legs gently, letting himself float on his back, eyes closed, with his arms spread wide. The peaceful hum of the world around him faded as the water cradled him. He let out a soft exhale, the tension in his shoulders easing little by little. For the first time all day, Marcus felt like he could truly relax. The rhythmic sound of his own breathing was soon joined by the distant sounds of children laughing and playing in the shallow end of the pool. Some parents chatted idly on the poolside chairs while others took the opportunity to read or scroll through their phones. The ambience was peaceful, almost like a perfect snapshot of suburban tranquility. Marcus allowed himself to sink lower into the water, feeling the refreshing coolness envelope him as he closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he forgot the long hours of labor, the unfairness he had encountered just a few days ago at work, the judgment from some of the neighbors who never quite accepted him. Here, he was just another man enjoying the simple joy of being submerged in the water under the warm sun. The sense of calm was everything Marcus needed. The water, smooth as silk against his skin, washed away the stress that had piled up during the day. His thoughts drifted, and he reflected on the small victories of his life, the promotion he had fought for at work, the peace he had found after a difficult move to this area. For once, he didn't have to carry the weight of the world. Here, in the pool, there was just him and the stillness. But the moment would not last. A loud splash from the shallow end broke his concentration. Marcus opened his eyes, annoyed by the intrusion, but it wasn't the sound of children playing that caused his unease. It was the abrupt, shrill voice that pierced through the air, sharply interrupting his rare moment of peace. "What do you think you're doing here?" The voice was unmistakable. Marcus turned his head sharply to find the source of the disturbance. Standing at the edge of the pool, arms crossed and a hard expression on her face, was Karen Fields, the pool manager. She was in her late 40s, her pale skin flushed with the faintest hint of sunburn, a scowl permanently etched across her face. Her sharp eyes scanned him, and for a moment, Marcus felt as though he were being scrutinized under a magnifying glass, every inch of him examined with disdain. Karen was one of those people in the neighborhood who seemed to thrive on rules that didn't always seem fair to everyone. She had been known to show an unusual amount of disdain for some of the black residents in the area, and Marcus had overheard murmurs from others in the community who shared the sentiment. He had never interacted with her much before, but he knew enough to be wary. He had heard whispers about her so-called high standards for the pool. But today, he never imagined she would make him the subject of her judgment. Startled by her abrupt question, Marcus blinked, confusion flooding his mind. He hadn't even noticed her approach, but there she stood, poised at the edge of the pool, her eyes narrow and cold. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with confusion. "What do you think you're doing here?" she repeated, her voice sharp like a knife. "You don't belong here." Marcus furrowed his brow, his mind racing. He had been a regular visitor to this pool for several months. His membership was in good standing, and there had never been any issue with him using the facilities. Yet, Karen stood there accusing him of something, her stance as if she was about to physically eject him from the water. His patience, worn thin by the long day, threatened to snap, but he took a slow breath, keeping his composure. "I'm swimming. I come here every evening," he replied, his voice steady, though his confusion deepened. Karen's lips curled into a thin, disapproving line, and she crossed her arms tighter. "Not anymore. This pool isn't for the likes of you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I've had enough of you and others like you thinking you can just take up space here." Marcus froze, the words hitting him like a cold slap to the face. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The pool, a public space, was apparently not open to him because of his skin color. He stared at her, his disbelief turning to quiet anger. "This is a public pool," Marcus said firmly, standing up slowly in the water. His tall frame rose from the water as he climbed out, dripping wet but resolute. He was no longer going to just take her words lying down. Karen's eyes flicked over him, taking in his damp form, before she scoffed and jabbed a finger in his direction. "It's not for people like you, and you know it," she sneered. "You're contaminating the water just by being here." Her gaze raked over his skin, her disgust palpable. "This place can't be polluted by your presence. It's not meant for people of your kind." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to keep his composure. Her words were cruel, venomous, and they cut deeper than he wanted to admit. His jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that reacting with anger would only escalate the situation. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice low but powerful. "I'm just here to swim. I'm a paying member, just like everyone else. What gives you the right to tell me that I don't belong here?" Karen's face twisted further, her contempt oozing from every word. "People like you always think you can just take what you want. This pool is meant for people with standards, not for people like you," she spat. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the pool as if to garner support. "You can't just be here," she muttered, barely looking at him. "I'll have you removed if I have to." Marcus stood tall, ignoring the slight tremor of anger that threatened to overtake him. He could feel the eyes of the other poolgoers on him now, but the tension in the air was thick, and he refused to back down. He had every right to be here, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel otherwise. This wasn't just a battle for a spot at the pool, this was about something deeper. It was a fight for respect, for dignity, and for the right to exist without fear of judgment or exclusion based on the color of his skin. But before he could speak again, something unexpected happened. The confrontation. The air around the pool had shifted. The gentle hum of conversation had ceased, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Marcus felt every pair of eyes on him, some curious, some apprehensive, and others just as stunned as he was. There were a few murmurs among the onlookers, but no one moved to intervene, as if they were all waiting for someone to act. Karen's stance remained unwavering, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes burning with a mixture of superiority and disdain. She looked at Marcus with contempt, almost as if she were a judge about to deliver a verdict. Her words, though harsh and venomous, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marcus stood there, water dripping from his skin, still processing what she had said. Her words stung, not just because of their cruelty but because they were rooted in something far more insidious, racism, prejudice, and the belief that he didn't belong simply because of the color of his skin. But Marcus wasn't just a man of physical strength, he was a man of willpower and dignity. And that, above all, was what kept him grounded. "I don't know who you think you are," Marcus began, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority, "but you don't get to decide who belongs here." His eyes locked with Karen's, unflinching. "I've been coming here for months. I pay my dues, and I follow the rules, just like everyone else. I'm not going anywhere." The pool, once a place of refuge, now felt like a battlefield. Marcus could feel the heat from the sun on his back, but the chill in the air had nothing to do with the weather. There was an oppressive weight, thick with animosity, that seemed to hang between him and Karen. But as much as she wanted to impose her will, Marcus refused to back down. His body tensed, ready to respond, but he knew better than to let anger control him. Instead, he held her gaze, determined not to show weakness. Karen, for a moment, seemed taken aback by his response. She hadn't expected him to stand his ground. In her experience, people like Marcus usually cowered or backed down when faced with her authority. But this time was different. She opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, a sharp voice broke the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was cool, authoritative, and Marcus turned instinctively toward it, his body relaxing slightly as he recognized the speaker. It was Joseph Reed, the owner of the community center and a well-respected figure in the area. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and always carried an air of calm confidence. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Joseph, and he was known for his fair approach to resolving conflicts. His reputation was built on years of working hard to maintain peace and equality in the community. Karen's eyes flicked nervously toward Joseph, but her posture remained stiff. "This man is trespassing," she said, her voice lacking the venom it had held moments before. "He doesn't belong here, and I won't have him ruining the pool for everyone else." Joseph's expression was unreadable as he took a step forward. He looked at Marcus first, then at Karen. "I see," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And what exactly do you mean by that, Karen?" Karen shifted uncomfortably, momentarily losing her usual composure. She fumbled for words, her defense crumbling under the weight of Joseph's presence. He's not a resident here," she muttered, struggling to find a valid reason for her actions. "This is a private pool for members, and I don't want him here." Joseph raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "Is that so? Marcus, are you a member of this community?" Marcus nodded without hesitation, his voice steady and clear. "Yes, I am. I've been paying my membership fees for months. This is a public pool, and I have every right to be here." Karen's face flushed with anger as Joseph turned his attention back to her. "And what about the rest of your claims, Karen? Are they based on anything other than personal prejudice?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a warning in his tone. "We have rules in this community, and they apply to everyone, equally." Karen's cheeks turned red, the truth of Joseph's words starting to sink in. She flared her arms as if to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. "I just don't think this is the kind of environment we should be promoting," she muttered, though the words were weak, lacking conviction. Joseph's gaze hardened, and he stepped closer to Marcus, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let me make one thing clear, Karen," he said, his tone unyielding. "This pool is for the community. That means all of it. Every person who pays their dues, regardless of their race, gender, or background. I will not tolerate discrimination, and neither should you." Karen's mouth snapped shut as she recoiled from his words, the sting of the reprimand sinking in. She had hoped to have Marcus removed with just a few sharp words, but she was met with resistance she hadn't expected. The crowd around the pool was now watching closely, some of them nodding in agreement with Joseph's words. For the first time, it seemed as though the tide was turning. A few people shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, but no one spoke against Joseph. The weight of Karen's discriminatory actions became undeniable. The community had seen enough of this kind of behavior. And now, there was someone standing up for what was right. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for support, but she found none. Everyone seemed to be waiting for her to admit her mistake, to back down, but she couldn't. Her pride wouldn't allow it. "I won't let this go," Karen said through gritted teeth, her voice full of venom. "You can't just let him get away with this." Joseph remained calm, his demeanor unshaken. "You're right. This isn't going anywhere. But I don't think it's going to go the way you're hoping." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "I'll be reporting this, Karen. And if you continue with this kind of behavior, you'll be removed from managing this pool. You'll be held accountable for your actions." The reality of the situation began to set in for Karen. She could feel the eyes of the onlookers on her, and for the first time, she realized she had overstepped. The support she expected to find in her efforts to oust Marcus was non-existent. In fact, it was quite the opposite. She was losing the audience she had once commanded. Marcus stood silent, his heart still racing, but he knew the fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about this moment, this pool. It was about the message it sent, the idea that no matter how small the battle seemed, standing up for what's right was always worth it. As Karen sputtered in frustration, Joseph's calm authority continued to guide the conversation. "Karen, I suggest you take the rest of the day off. I'll be handling the matter from here." The fight, for now, had been won. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. An unexpected ally. The tension in the air hung like a thick fog, but as Karen finally fell silent, Marcus felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The moment had shifted. He had expected the usual escalation, a confrontation that would leave him isolated and further marginalized. But instead, Joseph's presence and calm intervention had turned the tide. The powerful weight of his words, combined with the support of the pool-goers, seemed to shake Karen to her core. For a few moments, Karen stood there, her face flushed and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her lips quivered as if she was trying to form a response, but nothing came out. She was lost for words, unable to fight back in a way that would preserve her authority. It was as though her foundation had crumbled beneath her, and all that remained was a brittle shell of defiance. Joseph, meanwhile, turned to Marcus, giving him a reassuring nod. "I'm glad you stayed calm through that," he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet admiration. "It's not easy to face that kind of animosity, but you handled yourself with dignity." Marcus nodded in return, though his jaw was still tight, and his hands trembled slightly from the raw anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. "I've had to learn how to keep my composure," he said, his voice tinged with the weariness of experience. "I'm tired of being silenced. But it's hard not to fight back when you're treated like you don't belong." Joseph's eyes softened with understanding. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. "Sometimes, Marcus, the real fight is about how we respond to those who try to break us. The fact that you're still standing here, unwavering, that's your victory." As Marcus took in Joseph's words, something inside him shifted. The weight of the world felt a little lighter, the sense of isolation he often carried a little less burdensome. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone. Joseph, a man who had worked tirelessly for the community's well-being, had become his unexpected ally in this battle. Meanwhile, Karen, still reeling from the confrontation, took a hesitant step back. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came. The residents, who had been watching quietly, began to murmur among themselves. The feeling of collective support for Marcus was palpable. People shifted in their seats, exchanging looks, and a few even nodded in quiet solidarity. Joseph's commanding presence had made it clear, no one was going to let this injustice slide. "Karen, I'll be having a meeting with the other community leaders later today," Joseph continued, his voice calm but firm. "We'll review the incident and take appropriate action. I suggest you go home for now and reflect on your actions." Karen's face twisted with a combination of indignation and shame. She had clearly expected to wield her authority and expel Marcus from the pool without resistance, but now, standing before Joseph and a growing crowd of witnesses, she had no more cards to play. Her expression was a mix of frustration and disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom that she had lost control of the situation. "I won't forget this," Karen finally spat, her words thin and sharp as a dagger. "You'll regret this, Joseph. I'll make sure of it." Joseph didn't flinch. "I'm sure you will," Karen," he replied. "But don't forget that this community is stronger than any one person's prejudices." With that, Karen turned on her heel and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. As she disappeared around the corner of the pool area, the tension that had hung in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by an almost palpable sense of relief. Marcus stood there for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. The anger still pulsed through his veins, but it was now accompanied by a deep sense of resolve. He had faced Karen's venomous words head-on, and with Joseph's help, he had not only defended himself but had stood tall for something much bigger than just his right to swim in the pool. The others at the pool began to speak, their voices rising in hushed tones. Some were quietly congratulating Marcus for his bravery, while others were more contemplative, reflecting on the injustice they had just witnessed. As Marcus made his way back to the poolside, he noticed a few familiar faces from the neighborhood. One of them, a woman in her late 30s named Maya, approached him with a soft smile. She had lived in the community for years and had always been friendly, though they had never exchanged more than pleasantries until now. "Marcus," Maya said, her voice gentle, "I just wanted to say, thank you for standing up like that. We've all seen how Karen's been acting, but none of us had the courage to do anything. You did, and we're grateful." Marcus gave her a small nod, appreciating her words. "It's not easy, but I can't just let people like her control the narrative. We all deserve respect." Maya's eyes softened, and she glanced around at the other residents who were now slowly beginning to gather their things and leave. "You know, this has been a long time coming," she said quietly. "People like Karen have been holding power for too long. But today, you showed us all what standing up looks like." The thought lingered in Marcus's mind as Maya continued to speak, and he realized that today wasn't just a personal victory, it was a collective one. He wasn't alone in this fight. The silent majority, the ones who had quietly borne witness to Karen's prejudice for far too long, were now finding their voices. There was power in unity, and he had just sparked something in them. As Maya walked away, Marcus sat down by the poolside and took a deep breath. The sound of the water lapping against the edge of the pool was oddly soothing, but now it held a deeper significance. It wasn't just the sound of peace, it was the sound of change. Joseph, who had been standing nearby, watched Marcus quietly. "You did more today than you realize," he said, his tone measured but full of pride. "Sometimes, the smallest actions have the biggest impact. People will remember this." Marcus looked at him, gratitude welling up inside him. "I just wanted to be left alone to swim," he said with a tired laugh, but Joseph smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Sometimes, that's all it takes to ignite a spark. You've started something here, Marcus. And you've shown everyone that standing up doesn't mean being loud, it means being steadfast." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the pool, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The fight wasn't over, he knew that. But today, something had shifted. It wasn't just the pool that had changed. It was the community itself, the very fabric of it, beginning to unravel the threads of division and prejudice. And Marcus? He would keep fighting, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of being told they didn't belong, the struggle for dignity. The following morning, Marcus awoke to the soft hum of his alarm clock. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the familiar tension in his shoulders from the long hours he had worked the previous day. But today, something felt different. There was a quiet confidence in his movements, a strength that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just carrying the weight of his responsibilities anymore, he was carrying the weight of a collective battle, a fight for dignity that he hadn't fully understood until now. The events at the pool the day before had left a lasting impact on the entire community. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by the time Marcus had finished his breakfast, he had received several calls and messages from people offering their support. He was humbled, though the echoes of Karen's words still haunted him. "You're contaminating the water," she had said. He couldn't shake the cruelty in her voice, the unmistakable tone of prejudice that seemed to leak from every syllable. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger narrative, one that had been woven into the fabric of the community long before Marcus had arrived. As he drove to work, his thoughts raced. He had expected to face challenges in this neighborhood, but he hadn't anticipated something so blatant, so personal. The racism he had encountered wasn't the kind that was easy to ignore, it wasn't the quiet microaggressions or the whispers behind closed doors. No, this was out in the open, raw and unfiltered. And he couldn't just walk away from it. He knew that now. The day was long, filled with the usual hustle and bustle of his second job, but his mind never strayed far from the pool and the events that had unfolded. He found himself reflecting on Joseph's words, "The real fight is about how we respond." Marcus had responded with calm resolve, with dignity. But was that enough? Was it enough to simply stand tall in the face of prejudice, or did he need to do more? The question gnawed at him throughout the day, tugging at the edges of his focus. By the time the evening rolled around, Marcus had made up his mind. He couldn't let this incident slip into the background. He had to keep pushing. He couldn't be the only one standing against the tide of hatred and division. As he made his way to the community pool that evening, he felt the familiar weight of the world on his shoulders. But it didn't feel quite as heavy as it had before. He had been validated by Joseph's intervention, but more than that, he had been empowered by the support of his neighbors. There was a shift happening, one that he could feel in the air, in the way people interacted with him. When Marcus arrived at the pool, he was surprised to find more people than usual gathered near the water. As he walked in, a few of the regulars waved at him, offering warm smiles and nods. It wasn't just the usual greetings, it was something more. It was a recognition of solidarity, of shared understanding. He approached the poolside, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of Karen. He half expected her to be there, perhaps waiting to make another attempt at confrontation. But as he took a seat near the edge of the water, he saw that Karen wasn't there. Instead, a few of the residents from the previous day, including Maya, had gathered near the poolside, chatting in small groups. Some of them had brought snacks, and the air was filled with laughter and light-hearted banter. But the tone was different, more inclusive, less fractured. Maya noticed him first, her eyes lighting up as she walked over to him. "Marcus, hey. It's good to see you back here," she said with a warm smile, the kind of smile that conveyed something deeper than politeness. It was a smile that said, "We stand with you." "Thanks, Maya," Marcus replied, giving her a nod. "It feels good to be here again." As they spoke, more of the neighbors approached. One of them, an older woman named Janet, joined the conversation. "You know," Janet began, her voice tinged with a soft southern drawl, "I've been coming to this pool for years. But after yesterday, I don't think I'll ever look at it the same way." "What you did, Marcus, it made a difference." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as Janet's words sank in. He hadn't expected to hear such praise, especially not from someone who had been so quiet in the past. He wasn't in this for recognition, he just wanted to make sure that no one else had to face the kind of treatment Karen had subjected him to. But to hear that his actions had reverberated through the community in such a positive way, it hit him harder than he anticipated. "Thank you," he said quietly, feeling the weight of gratitude in his voice. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We've all been part of something that needs to change. Yesterday was just one moment. We have to keep standing up." Janet nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You're right. But you gave us all the courage to speak up. I've seen things, heard things, and stayed silent for too long. But not anymore. Not after yesterday." Maya chimed in, her voice steady. "You've got a lot of people behind you now, Marcus. We won't let anyone treat us like that again." As the conversation grew, Marcus felt something shift within him. The community he had once viewed as distant, as something he was just passing through, was beginning to feel like home. These people, his neighbors, were no longer strangers. They were allies, united by a common purpose. They were all fighting the same fight, whether they realized it or not. And then, as if summoned by the gravity of the moment, Joseph arrived. He walked over to Marcus with a knowing look on his face, as if he had anticipated the unfolding of this very conversation. He took a seat beside Marcus, his calm demeanor offering further reassurance. "I see the community is coming together," Joseph said with a nod, looking around at the gathering. "This is what it looks like when we stand together. It's powerful." Marcus looked around, taking in the faces of those who had gathered. He saw Maya, Janet, and others from the neighborhood, all of them engaged in conversation, sharing their thoughts and experiences. There was a sense of unity in the air, a collective understanding that something had changed, something had shifted. The fight against Karen's bigotry was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had felt marginalized, disrespected, or silenced. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his voice filled with quiet strength. "It feels different now. People are talking, they're listening. Maybe it wasn't just about me. Maybe it was about all of us finding our voice." Joseph smiled. "Exactly. And that's how change happens. One moment, one person at a time." Marcus sat back, the cool water lapping at the edge of the pool, the evening air now filled with a quiet but palpable sense of hope. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he truly believed in the possibility of victory. Not just for him, but for everyone. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The ripple effect of his stand against Karen had spread further than he could have imagined. And together, the community was starting to rewrite the narrative of who belonged, who mattered, and who would be heard. Ripples of change. The sun had set, and the soft glow of evening settled over the community pool, casting long shadows across the water. Marcus sat by the edge, his feet dangling in the cool depths. He had spent most of the evening with his neighbors, speaking openly about what had happened, about the change they were all experiencing. The conversations had moved from small talk to more profound discussions on identity, inclusion, and the power of standing up to injustice. And Marcus realized something that both humbled and strengthened him: what had started as a personal fight for his dignity had now become a collective movement. When Karen had confronted him, it had been easy to feel isolated, as if his battle was his alone. But now, as he looked around at the group gathered near the pool, he could see how far-reaching that moment had been. The ripple effect of his stand had expanded beyond the confines of the pool, reaching people who had once been silent, people who had felt the sting of prejudice but had never dared speak up. In the days following the confrontation, the community had begun to change. Small shifts in attitude, in actions, had started to show themselves. People who had previously turned away from conflict had begun speaking out against discrimination. The once muted voices of solidarity were now loud and clear. Marcus didn't know exactly when it had happened, but he had helped create a space where people felt safe enough to speak their truth. Yet, not everything was as smooth as it seemed. Though the atmosphere had shifted, there was still an undercurrent of tension. Karen, though dismissed from her position as pool manager, hadn't disappeared from the neighborhood. Word around town was that she was rallying others, those who were still loyal to her, those who shared her narrow views, hoping to regain some control. Marcus knew that the struggle wasn't over. Change, true change, was a long game, and it would take more than a single act of defiance to tear down the walls of division that had been built over years. But as he sat there, surrounded by people who were committed to pushing forward, he realized that the power wasn't in just one voice. It was in the collective. The strength was in the unity of those willing to rise above hate and division. The next few days passed in a blur of community meetings and conversations. Joseph had called for a town hall, where residents could voice their concerns and discuss the future of the neighborhood. Marcus wasn't sure what to expect, but he felt a growing sense of hope each time he entered the room. People who had been hesitant before were now openly engaging in the discussions, many of them acknowledging the need for a change in the way the community handled race, identity, and belonging. At the town hall meeting, Marcus stood at the back of the room, watching the faces of his neighbors as they spoke. He had expected some resistance, perhaps even more harsh words from those who sympathized with Karen, but what he saw instead was a genuine desire for progress. Even those who had remained silent before now found their voices. A woman named Sarah, a mother of two who had always kept a low profile in the neighborhood, stood up and spoke with surprising clarity. "I've lived here for 20 years, Sarah began, her voice a bit shaky at first, and I never realized how blind I'd been to what was happening around me. It wasn't that I didn't see the problems, it was that I didn't think it was my problem. But after seeing what happened at the pool, I realized that if we don't stand together, nothing will ever change." The room fell silent for a moment, and then people began to nod, some even murmuring in agreement. For Marcus, it was a powerful moment. Sarah's words resonated with him deeply because they reflected something he had known all along, that change often comes from the most unexpected places. It was not just those who had been directly affected by prejudice who could make a difference. It was everyone, every voice, whether loud or quiet, that could contribute to building a stronger, more inclusive community. As the meeting continued, other residents shared their thoughts, offering ideas for how to make the neighborhood more inclusive and welcoming for everyone. There were talks of organizing events that celebrated diversity, creating forums where people could discuss their experiences, and implementing programs that ensured fair treatment for all. But the most encouraging part was the unanimous support for one idea that Marcus had suggested, the creation of a community committee dedicated to overseeing fairness and addressing grievances, no matter how big or small. "We need a space where we can bring our concerns without fear," Marcus had said, his voice steady and strong. "A place where everyone feels safe to speak up." Joseph had been an advocate for the idea, and soon the community rallied behind it. The committee would be composed of residents from all backgrounds, ensuring that no one person or group would hold too much power. It would be a way to ensure that every voice was heard and that justice was maintained within the neighborhood. As the meeting came to a close, Marcus felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The work was far from finished, but there was no denying the momentum that had been created. People were willing to fight for a better, more inclusive future. The seeds had been planted. But as he left the town hall, walking through the quiet streets, Marcus couldn't shake the thought that there was still more to be done. Change was happening, yes, but it wasn't guaranteed to stick. There were still many challenges ahead. He thought of Karen, still lurking in the background, still looking for ways to tear the community apart. But this time, it was different. The people who had once been complacent were no longer silent. They had seen what could happen when someone stood up, and they were ready to do the same. The next morning, as Marcus returned to the pool, he was greeted by familiar faces. Janet waved from a chair, her smile warm and inviting. Maya was chatting with a few of the younger residents, laughing easily. And as Marcus approached, he noticed a subtle but significant change in the air. The pool, which had once felt like an island of isolation, now felt like a true community hub. It wasn't just a place for leisure, it was a place for gathering, for dialogue, for change. "Hey, Marcus," Maya called out, waving him over. "You won't believe what happened last night. Sarah spoke at the meeting, did you hear her? She's ready to lead the charge for the new committee." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I heard," he said. "That was a big step. It's exactly what we need." As the group continued to talk, Marcus realized that this was just the beginning. The community that had once been fractured was now stronger, more united than ever. The struggle for dignity wasn't just about confronting one person's prejudice. It was about changing the narrative of the entire neighborhood. Karen might have been defeated for now, but Marcus knew that the real work lay ahead. The battle for equality, for respect, for fairness, it was ongoing. But in that moment, as he stood with his neighbors, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Real, tangible hope. The kind of hope that came from people coming together, supporting each other, and choosing to rise above hate. And for the first time in his life, Marcus was truly proud to be part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just a lone voice anymore. He was part of a movement, and the change they were creating was powerful, undeniable, and unstoppable. A new beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus, now fully immersed in the changes happening within the community, found himself at the heart of it all. The creation of the new community committee had sparked a wave of participation from people who had once remained silent, and there was an undeniable shift in the air. The neighborhood was no longer a place where division festered in the background, it was a place where people were coming together, actively choosing unity over hatred. As the weeks went by, the impact of the town hall meeting continued to resonate. More and more residents attended the meetings, not just to speak about their grievances, but to offer solutions. The community was beginning to evolve in ways Marcus had never imagined. Conversations about race, identity, and belonging were no longer whispered in the corners of the pool area or behind closed doors. They were being had out in the open, and for the first time, Marcus felt like he wasn't the only one carrying the burden of change. At the community pool, the air felt lighter, more open. What was once a place of casual recreation had transformed into a symbol of transformation, a place where people gathered to build relationships, discuss important issues, and most importantly, to celebrate their shared humanity. Marcus had become a symbol of change, not because he was some extraordinary figure, but because he had chosen, in that one crucial moment, to stand firm against injustice. And by doing so, he had inspired others to do the same. On a particularly warm Saturday afternoon, as Marcus sat by the pool, watching the children play and the older residents lounge in the sun, he reflected on how far they had come. Just a few months ago, he had been uncertain of his place in the neighborhood. The prejudice he had faced had made him feel like an outsider in what was supposed to be his home. But now, things were different. The community had embraced him, not just because of his strength in the face of adversity, but because of his willingness to lead by example. To be vulnerable, to show that it wasn't about fighting hatred with more hatred, but about standing firm in dignity and showing others that their voices mattered. He had received messages of support from many of the residents. People who had once been reluctant to engage in the fight for equality were now leaders in their own right, organizing events that promoted diversity, understanding, and inclusion. The residents had come together to form community outreach programs, and they had even started a mentorship initiative for young people to teach them the importance of respect, empathy, and standing up for what's right. But even as the community flourished, Marcus knew that the battle wasn't truly over. Change, he had learned, was not instantaneous. It was a slow process that required constant nurturing. People like Karen, who refused to accept the evolving norms of the world, still lingered in the shadows, trying to resist change, trying to hold on to the old ways of thinking. Marcus knew that there would always be those who fought progress, who clung to fear and hatred, but he had learned something vital. True progress wasn't about eradicating all the obstacles, it was about continuing to push forward, no matter how small the steps were. It was a Saturday afternoon when Marcus got the call that would confirm what he had known all along, that change was both possible and sustainable. The new community committee had successfully voted to establish a series of programs that would address the ongoing need for equity, not just in the neighborhood but across the city. Marcus was invited to be a speaker at the first public event, an event that would officially kick off the new era of inclusion in the neighborhood. As he prepared for the event, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He had never expected to be in this position. All he had wanted was to enjoy a peaceful swim in the pool. Yet, here he was, about to stand before a crowd of people who had once been divided, speaking to them about unity, about love, and about the need to fight for a future where everyone had a seat at the table. The evening of the event arrived, and the atmosphere at the community center was electric. There were banners and signs that read, "Unity over division, together we rise," and "Strength in diversity." The room was filled with people from all walks of life, young and old, different races, different backgrounds, but all united in a shared belief in the power of change. Marcus stood backstage, his heart racing. He had spoken to many people over the past weeks, offering words of encouragement, but this felt different. This was his moment to speak not just for himself, but for everyone who had fought, silently and not so silently, for a better, more just world. As he walked onto the stage, the applause that greeted him felt overwhelming. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, before stepping up to the microphone. His eyes scanned the room, resting on the familiar faces of his neighbors, faces that had once been passive bystanders but were now active participants in building a more inclusive world. "Good evening, everyone," Marcus began, his voice strong yet filled with humility. "It's an honor to be here tonight, to stand before you all, not just as a member of this community, but as someone who believes, deeply, in the power of change." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The words he had prepared felt almost insufficient now. What he had learned over the past few months was that no speech could fully capture the weight of the journey they had all been on. "I came to this community like many of you, looking for a place to call home. A place where I could live in peace, a place where I could feel accepted. What I didn't expect was that I would have to fight, not just for my right to exist here, but for the right of everyone who has ever been told they don't belong." The room was silent, and Marcus could feel the eyes of the audience on him. He felt the power of their shared experience, their collective journey toward a brighter future. "But here we are," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "standing together, fighting for something bigger than ourselves. We've come a long way, but this is just the beginning. The fight for equality, for respect, for love, it doesn't end with one victory. It continues with every conversation we have, with every time we choose to stand up for someone who is being hurt, ignored, or pushed aside. The real change comes when we keep pushing, even when it feels hard. Even when the road ahead seems impossible." The crowd erupted into applause once more, and Marcus's heart swelled with pride. He knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when they, as a community, would commit to this journey together. "The world may never be perfect, but as long as we stand together," Marcus concluded, his voice filled with unwavering conviction, "we can make it better. We can create a world where every person is valued, no matter the color of their skin, the language they speak, or the way they look. That's the world I want to live in. And together, we can make it a reality." The applause that followed was deafening, a chorus of voices that, in that moment, sounded like a powerful promise. A promise that no matter the obstacles, they would continue to fight for the future they all deserved. As Marcus stepped off the stage, his heart still racing, he was met by the outstretched hands of his neighbors, their faces lit with gratitude, pride, and hope. He had become not just a voice for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt excluded. His journey wasn't over, but now, he knew that he wasn't walking it alone. The community was with him, and together, they had created something that would last for generations to come. And as Marcus looked out over the crowd, he realized that the most powerful thing about change wasn't the victory itself. It was the realization that together, they had built something that could never be undone. They had built a future.